China has been the subject of many a headline and, well, many an opinion throughout the years. And as our second largest trading partner, the relationship that Canada has with China is, well, important. As China has been increasing in its economic power on a global scale over the past decade, politicians, business leaders, and economists alike are all asking, well, what's China's impact on Canadians? Well, hey there, you're listening to The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host, Scott Crockett, and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. On today's episode, we are joined by Canada's former ambassador to China and renowned expert on Canada-China relations, David Mulroney, for a wide-ranging conversation about the rise and current state of play in China, the impact that China has had on Canadian prosperity, health, well-being, and security, and what the future of trade and diplomatic relations between these two countries looks like. If you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a quick review and rating. Now, on to the show.
Well, David, thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of The Brief. And well, I've been a big fan of your work for a long time, and I think lots of our listeners are probably familiar with your work. Maybe you could just begin by giving those listeners who aren't that familiar with you a bit of a background on you and what you've accomplished in your career.
Well, I was born on the East Coast in Halifax, Nova Scotia. My dad was in the Navy at the time. Grew up in Toronto and wrote the Foreign Service exam not once, but twice. First time I had the distinction of passing out during the interview. I had the flu, and I was conscious that as a question was asked, things were blacking out. And then the next sound I heard was my head hitting the table. So it took me a couple of chances, but I joined the Foreign Service the early 1980s and served mostly in Asia, in Korea, in Shanghai when we reopened our post, Malaysia, Taiwan, and finally my final post was Beijing as ambassador, and I thoroughly enjoyed every minute of that. Since my retirement in 2012, I've continued to focus on China, and I wrote a book about it that came out in about 2015. And then I spent 3 years running University of St. Michael's College, which is the Catholic college within the University of Toronto system. And that added significantly to the gray hairs you see on my head. Your listeners will not see that, but you can testify to that.
I can attest you got a couple of. Yeah.
I got a couple of gray hairs. And so that kind of brings you up to where I am now. I remain interested in China, and I'd actually planned to sort of step out of the China business and hand it over to others. But I've stayed in because I feel so concerned that we haven't got it right. And not that I have the ego to think that I've got all the answers, but I think I can ask some of the questions that we haven't been asking. And that's what worries me most, that we haven't been asking the right questions about a changing China.
Well, David, why don't we just start there? What are some of the questions that we haven't been asking that we should be asking about a changing China?
Well, I think we've suffered under some illusions and possibly delusions about China. The first being that China is our friend. And that's not to say that we need to feel negative about China or to demonize China, but it's certainly, the relationship isn't about friendship. China sees is very insecure about its place in the world, but it has lofty ambitions, and those ambitions have intensified under the leadership of the current president and head of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, to the extent that I think China seeks global leadership. And it seeks to attain that not through persuasion necessarily, although it would be happy to persuade people, but through, as often as not, covert means to influence countries, to silence them on controversial issues, to bring them over at least to a position of neutrality, and above all, to weaken the hold that the United States has on the international system, to pull away allies of the United States, and that would include Canada. And I just don't think we've been thinking about that clearly enough.
So let's dive into that a little bit deeper. I'd like your kind of overview on what I might call the state of play on China. I mentioned to you when we were getting ready for this podcast that we recently had on the strategist, Peter Zeihan, the geopolitical strategist. And we talked a lot about China during that episode, particularly his concerns over China's population and maybe a regional aggression as well. What's your view, your sort of broad overview on the geopolitical state of China right now?
Well, I think things changed dramatically with the arrival on the scene of this person I mentioned, Xi Jinping. I met Xi a couple of times. I was sort of a fly on the wall in meetings with him during my own time in China, but he became the leader after I left. And up until the point I left, China was still managing its role in the world carefully. The Chinese had a strategy that had worked for a long time, which is really hide your capabilities, bide your time. And I translated that as no dancing in the end zone. Be discreet about what you can accomplish, encourage the world to think of you as a developing country and shower on you the benefits of a developing country, and don't arouse any anxieties about your ambitions. That began to change early in the millennium. First, when China was allowed to enter the WTO, and we saw the World Trade Organization, we saw the great expansion in Chinese trade and investment. It was mind-boggling in the course of that first decade. And also at the end of the first decade, you had the financial crisis, the global financial crisis. And to its credit, China was one of the few countries that emerged not unscathed, but virtually unscathed. And growth in the China market helped raise all boats. It helped to bring the world out of recession. And I saw myself sitting in Beijing, as I did from 2009 to 2012, all kinds of Canadians arriving and saying, I've seen the future and it's China. They'd been so demoralized by what had been happening in Canada, and the same thing was happening to Americans and Europeans and others. China was full of gleaming cities and impressive buildings and neat architecture and high-speed trains. And people began to say, maybe the Chinese are onto something. Maybe our own system, not just our economic system, but our political system is inferior. China has a way of getting things done. And the Chinese, read their own headlines and believed them. They began to believe that they didn't have to bide their time, that in fact their time had come earlier than they had anticipated. And this is something that Xi Jinping really believes. He talks about opportunities not seen in 100 years. He talks about the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. His sense is that China is really on the verge of becoming the most powerful country in the world, and all it needs to do is to work a little bit harder at eclipsing the United States, at weakening the United States, and it will be there, which is why we've seen under Xi a great deal of global aggression, which you would not think wise normally because it's alienated so many countries. And you've seen a ramping up, I believe, of things like foreign interference, and we've seen this in Canada. So China is really seeking to secure its place, as it believes, as the predominant country in the world, and bend other countries to its will. And it's being much more direct, much more visible in terms of its aspirations.
I spent some time in China during some of the years that you're talking about, the mid 2000s, and I remember that sort of great economic awakening. And the view of a Canadian looking. I think the feeling was that we were headed maybe on this one-way, very positive street towards economic integration, and that Canada sort of believed that China would most likely become a partner like most of the other partners in the world had been, and our countries would slowly sort of integrate together. But somewhere along the way that changed. And in particular, you've talked about Xi Jinping. How specifically important is Xi to the story, and how much has he changed the direction of China?
Well, when people look at history, there are those people who believe that there are great breaks in history and major figures emerge, and others who see change as happening incrementally, and that even before that great figure emerged, people were thinking the way he or she was thinking. I'm a little bit of that school. You could see the seeds of China's current ambition before Xi Jinping. That the leader that was in power when I was there, Hu Jintao, was already beginning to want to break out of that box. But it didn't happen decisively until Xi arrived on the scene. Now, Xi's father had been a very senior official in Mao's China and was deposed. He was broken by the system. And Xi himself was sent down to the countryside. He's roughly the same age as I am. He's close to 70 years old. And people in that age bracket were young people during the Cultural Revolution, and the prosperous ones, the people from elites, were sent out into the countryside to basically learn what life is like from the perspective of a peasant, and to experience the hardship of life. So it's re-education. You would think that might make him anti-party, seeing his father treated like this and his own bitter experience. But I think it fed in him the belief that there is no safety outside the party. So he is the ultimate party man. And he's done two things, or he's ensured that two things have happened that have accelerated this rise in the power of the Chinese state. And both of them are reversals of things that have been happening before, things that were still happening when I was there up to 2012, and that reassured people in the West. One was a gradual introduction of market forces into the Chinese economy, so that Chinese companies, while still subject to a degree of state control, operated more like international companies. And this was beneficial to Canada and to other countries because things like the importance of price and quality and reliability began to matter more than directions from the central government. And it gave entrepreneurial Canadian firms opportunities in China, and it protected them from the arbitrary actions of the state, which had been a major problem before. And that has changed under Xi. He's foreclosed that. He's taken major corporate leaders and put them into a form of house arrest. He's ensured that the Communist Party has a much more authoritative position in Chinese firms. So that's sort of on hold. The other thing she did was change the direction of Chinese governance, which had, in the first decade of this century, focused on things like not democratic rule, but a consensus-based rule, so that you wouldn't have a single solitary leader, a strong man, and it's always been a man in the Chinese system. You'd have at least the people who were in the standing committee of the Politburo. That's the next level of authority, the 8 or 9 or 10 people who shared power, who really would share power and who would be part of decision making, and who had to be brought on side by a leader. That was becoming an accepted a norm in terms of Chinese governance. The other thing was term limits on the time a leader has in power, and it was set at 10 years, 2 5-year terms for the president, and the role of leader of the Communist Party, which goes with it, would similarly end after a decade. And that meant that
You're the historic third term, right?
You could no third term, but also you began to see partway through the leader's term who the next person likely to emerge might be. It reassured people that there was a turning over, a change, and no centralized power in a single strong person. She has decisively changed that. He is definitely more than first among equals. He is the paramount leader of China. Not quite what Mao Zedong was, but certainly more than his immediate predecessors. So he's turned the ship in very, very pronounced ways away from a more reassuring model from a Western perspective.
Canada is this very fortunate country, right? We're a long way away from most other places in the world, especially most places that we'd be concerned about. And we have lots of resources of our own. But David, in your book, Middle Power, Middle Kingdom, you say that China is having a direct impact today on Canadians' health, well-being, and security. Tell us why you think that.
Well, I think that, when I served in one of my last assignments in Ottawa was to run the Asia Pacific branch, which I'd always been in from when I first joined the government and went to Korea. I'd stayed in the Asia Pacific branch for a long time. So that was sort of a dream of mine. And I ran it during the SARS crisis. And that was back early in the first decade of the century. And I saw the impact first on Canadians abroad of SARS. And then as SARS reached Canada and reached various cities in Canada, including Toronto, but also Victoria and Vancouver, the impact on Canada as a country where we were made a sort of a pariah state, and Canadians all over the world were put in quarantine and locked in hotels, and the effect was dramatic. And we vowed that we would learn from that. We would recognize health as a national security concern. We wouldn't ever be fooled again. China made all kinds of commitments that, although it had not shared information during SARS, it would do so again. And all of that fell by the wayside. I use that as an example of the number of ways that China can impact on us, can have an effect on us. And I've seen that again and again. It can have an effect by deciding that it's going to boycott or punish a certain company in Canada, as we saw with canola, or a number of companies and producers, to punish the Canadian government for something that it didn't like. It can try to influence, I believe, elections or policy positions in Canada. So instead of having our China policy isn't just out there, isn't just theoretical, it's increasingly consequential to our life in Canada, to our security, to good governance, to our free and fair elections. And we've been slow to pick up on that.
I want to grab one thing because you brought up SARS. And I think one of the most interesting stories that people have been following relative to China over the last few years is their response to the COVID-19 pandemic and how that's been divergent from what we've seen in lots of other countries around the world. What do you think we need to know right now about China's response to COVID-19?
What we need to know is that when push comes to shove, China will not be transparent. We can't count entirely on China to tell us the truth if that truth is embarrassing. And that's cost us dearly. There are a couple of things that contribute to that. One of them is the ability that China has to influence the international system. So the World Health Organization was very slow to put pressure on China, to call China out for this lack of transparency. We also had our own political leaders who thought that flattery of China is the way to secure China's cooperation. Flattery only reinforces China's decision not to share information, not to change its policies. So again, we learn a painful lesson. The other thing I think is to use and to see health as an intelligence issue. New Zealand was doing some very interesting things, talking to expat doctors, reaching out to medical practitioners all throughout East Asia and Southeast Asia to try to get a sense and to build information about what was happening. I think we were very slow to do that. We were very passive and we were relying on China. So we shouldn't in any way relax the expectations or reduce the expectations we have for transparency from China, but we should be prepared for the fact that it's unlikely to meet them in the most important ways and prepare our defenses accordingly, including health-based information services.
Health is an intelligence issue. That's going to be something that rolls around in my head for a little bit. I don't think I've heard anyone else say that recently.
Well, you know, what happened right after SARS was that the Public Health Agency of Canada assigned doctors to key embassies. So we had Dr. Felix Lee in the embassy in Beijing. And part of what his office did, he wasn't the doctor for the Canadian community. He was a public health doctor whose staff read every newspaper article all throughout China about any small health emergency to begin to put that on the radar screen. Something's happening here. They talked to doctors from other countries. They were connected to all the key Chinese doctors. We closed that system down for some reason a little more than 10 years ago, for reasons that escape me. And we lost that sense of health as something that we need to approach almost in the same way that we approach foreign intelligence. We need to be aware of this. And countries that are more entrepreneurial. I remember listening to a radio interview with the members of the Toronto Chinese diaspora who were sharing information in a really interesting way right after the start of the pandemic about what was happening in China. We have a resource in Canada of people who are very knowledgeable, who are traveling back to China on a regular basis. They should have been, their advice should have been sought too, but we were gripped in a sort of passivity. Curiosity, a healthy curiosity is a really important habit to acquire.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move our attention a little bit more to the headlines of the day or the week. David, there have been numerous reports of Chinese interference in Canada and particularly in Canadian elections. These matters are still under some investigation. We're still uncovering some of the details that may be related to those. But would you give us your impression of how that interference in Canada has presented itself and how concerned or potentially unconcerned we need to be about it?
Well, Chinese interference has been with us for a long, long time. I think what we're seeing, though, is a change in terms of the scope and the ambition of that interference. And I think what China seeks to do is to use members of Canadian society, and by no means is this restricted to people of Chinese origin. It tries to find people who can help to deliver its message and can help to influence the Canadian government. My job in China as ambassador was to influence communities in China, but I did so publicly as the ambassador under the Canadian flag. What China is doing is different. So it seeks to infiltrate and undermine diaspora communities, student groups, Chinese language media, which now in Canada is basically all Beijing oriented. It seeks to influence Canadians who themselves have influence through contracts, free travel, perks, honorifics, titles, invitations, etc., all to carry a story about China into Canadian society. And it does this at every level of governance, at the municipal level, where it's involved, I think, in trying to influence municipal politics at the provincial level, and we've seen the allegations, and certainly at the federal level. And one of the things that worried me most in the recent past was, and this was during the crisis over the government's arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei, on an extradition request from the United States. And you'll recall that China's response was to seize two Canadians.
The two Michaels. Yes.
The two Michaels, not unrelated to the news headline today that you're just mentioning, where China is again cracking down on alleged spies who aren't spies at all. But we had this crisis developing. We had two young Canadians enduring, terrible conditions in Chinese prisons. And the demand from China is that we step away from our extradition treaty with the United States. We not let the process follow its normal course under a Canadian judge and through the Canadian legal system, that we simply hand Meng Wanzhou over. What I found discouraging was the number of prominent Canadians, some of them friends and mentors, who said, yeah, let's just hand it over. Resistance is futile. China's just too big and powerful. There was a kind of moral fatigue in Canada. So it's not just giving people money and getting them to betray secrets. It's wearing people down. It's encouraging them to simply give up the ghost and to become something like a vassal state. I wouldn't say Canada's a vassal state by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly. I detected in the Meng Wanzhou crisis an alarming weakening of resolve among the great and the good in Canada, people who influence opinion, and that worried me deeply.
Do you think Canada was right to detain Meng Wanzhou?
Yes, and I think we didn't do it because we're afraid of the United States or we act as a vassal of the United States. And the only, China itself treats its neighboring countries as vassal states, so it assumes that we will do this. We're a vassal of the United States. We do this because all countries that have the rule of law see the benefit in ensuring that people don't evade the rule of law by going from one country to another. Extradition is fundamental to the delivery of justice in a networked world. And it's tremendously important in a country that is with which we have so many connections. So the judge herself found that there was at least reason to have this process and this investigation. Was it working slowly? Did we wish it worked faster? Yes, indeed, but that's the nature of the justice system. But having that system is essential. And I think one of the legacies of the Meng Wanzhou crisis will be that in future, Canadian officials may, in the words to paraphrase one of the prominent Canadians who spoke out, may simply choose to look the other way. We resolved the Meng Wanzhou crisis the right way, but I wonder now whether we'd ever have the backbone to do this again.
In a policy piece earlier this year in the Globe and Mail, you put forward a somewhat controversial idea of a Canadian foreign agent registry. Tell us about that.
Well, and in fact, I wrote a paper about it back in 2019 because I was very interested in a project that the Australians had embarked on, where what they did in Australia was to say, if you want to act on behalf of a foreign principal, of a foreign state or an institution, organization controlled by a foreign state, you're free to do that in Australia, but you have to be transparent about it. And we're going to create a registry. And if you choose to do this work, you've got to enter your name into that registry so that Australians will know what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that was not without controversy. The Australians are still struggling to get it right. It's a difficult thing to do, but it came along with changes in Australian legislation that also said, it's against the law to knowingly work with a foreign state to shape or influence opinion in Australia without being transparent about it, and it's against the law to knowingly work for a foreign intelligence agency in any capacity. And immediately, strange things happened in Australia. So some prominent politicians and former politicians stepped off the boards of Chinese companies and said, well, I wasn't a foreign agent, but, I was wondering why I got this hefty board pay every month, and I was never asked for anything much to do. I guess maybe I shouldn't be on that board. And you now have a registry in Australia where you can look up a person or you can look up an organization and find out whether A, the person is working for a foreign government, and B, whether the organization is linked to a foreign government. So it's a healthy form of transparency in a country, Australia, that had begun to see problems in its own parliament, its own governance related to this. Similar initiatives were happening in the United States. They all for some time, since I think the Franklin Roosevelt administration had a Foreign Agents Registration Act, but it has become much more active. The FBI is much more active. I think the Department of Justice in the United States is opening an investigation on China, at least one a day. And it's also, we've seen action in Britain, where a person who was close to parliamentarians in the UK was identified as, I think, a person of interest, or a person who is associated with a foreign power. So these things are happening in other jurisdictions, but not happening in Canada. And one of the problems, I think, in Canada is that pieces that should fit together don't fit together. The Canadian Security and Intelligence Service can open an investigation, but it is reluctant or unable to share the necessary findings with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who might be responsible for the prosecution of such individuals. So there's a disconnect in the Canadian system. There's no requirement for transparency. And the result is, I think, that we're seen as, if you look at the United States, Australia, and Britain, for example, as our peers, we're the weakest when it comes to defending against interference. And guess what? That makes us the most likely to attract interference. So this I've been very interested in this, and very worried by our failure to move on this. And I think the recent newspaper reports, the global reports, the CBC reports, based on allegations made by unnamed CSIS officers, reflect a great deal of concern, frustration within the intelligence community about outrageous things that are happening that really do get to the integrity of our democratic institutions.
One of the criticisms that I've certainly seen of a potential foreign agent registry is the concern that it could be kind of inherently racist, that such a registry could be filled with almost exclusively Chinese names, for instance. How would you respond to that?
Well, the last line of that op-ed that I wrote that you mentioned said, foreign agent registry isn't racist, but assuming that it would only contain Chinese names is. One of the things we have to acknowledge is members of the diaspora are the first people victimized by China. China seeks, we've heard recently about these alleged Chinese police stations in Canada and other countries, where Chinese officials, these are black sites, these are sites that aren't disclosed to Canadian officials, where Chinese nationals, and in some cases Canadian nationals of Chinese origin, are brought and threatened as part of ongoing Chinese investigations into corruption back home, or maybe because of their politics or what they've said. This is outrageous, and it victimizes members of the diaspora. They also corrupt diaspora organizations, bend the flow of information, and they're particularly tough on Canadians of Tibetan and Uyghur origins, and Canadians of Chinese origin who have belonged to the Falun Gong movement. So this is a real issue. The other thing is, of course, when we talk about one of the key forms of Chinese interference, which is called elite capture, and that is seducing powerful people who appear on the nightly news and opine, people who were formerly, deputy ministers and still circulate with deputy ministers in Ottawa. These are not necessarily people of Chinese origin. They're people of all kinds of origin. So foreign agents come in many shapes and sizes. And I think it's simply a distraction to suggest, and a way of undermining the process to suggest that this is racist. It is absolutely not racist. And if anything, it seeks to remove a form of influence and harassment that has victimized our diaspora communities.
Turn to trade for a moment. It goes without saying that China is hugely important to Canada from a trade perspective, our second largest trading partner. Last year, I think in rough numbers, we exported about $28 billion worth of trade to China, mostly in terms of food and raw materials, and imported, over $80 billion worth. Talk to us about the concept of complementarity of trade, and what's your view of the Canada-Chinese trade relationship at the moment?
The idea of complementarity is something that's being discussed in Australia a lot. The other term they use is interdependence, and it came up because the previous Australian government was very tough on China, and the Prime Minister proposed at one point that there'd be an investigation into the origins of COVID-19, which made the Chinese ballistic. And among other things, they took trade measures against Australia. And if you do an analysis about that Chinese vengeance, you'll find that exports of Australian wine to China were basically wiped out, but exports of iron ore which is Australia's major export to China, was not significant. Were not significantly affected, nor were exports of coking coal. So that's because there's an interdependence. So we need to be thinking along these lines. We need to be thinking about the vulnerability to Chinese measures like this. And Canada has suffered in the past. I talked about canola, which we've gone through several phases of Chinese efforts to squeeze us and squeeze Western Canada on canola.
And is very relevant. Speaking as the Business Council of Alberta, lots.
Exactly. Well, and I had that very much in mind. And here's what we learned prior to the Xi Jinping era, when the Chinese tried to squeeze us on canola, that we had in a freer era in China, we had allies on the Chinese side, importers and end users, who really wanted Canadian canola. They didn't want the Chinese substitute product. So although the government was trying to squeeze us, we had allies inside the system who were helping us to make our case and to crack the market back open. The other thing we looked at was alternative uses of Canadian canola and things that the Chinese would be interested in, such as feed for cattle. And then there was a lot of interesting talk about the need to diversify the way we ship canola and maybe do further processing in Canada to make us less vulnerable to these big sweeping measures by China to exclude us. So I think things have gotten more difficult in the Xi Jinping era, because I think you hear less now from the people who actually benefit from trade and more from the government. And China is able to withstand a lot more pain than Canada is, because it's not a democratic system. But I think we do have to be mindful of this question of interdependence as we look at trade risk with China. We certainly have to diversify markets, but we need to take a hard look at areas where China's dependence on Canada will increase. Agriculture is one of those areas. China is suffering major problems in terms of water supply. North China is essentially a desert now. Soil degradation, contaminated soil is a significant problem, as is the use of arable land for property development. And then you have the problem of state ownership of the land, which makes it hard for farmers to become more entrepreneurial and to escape from sort of rural poverty. So China is going to need countries like Canada. It will try, if it's mad at Canada, to buy more from Australia or the United States or Brazil or other competitors. But over the long term, there is this undeniable need, as prosperous Chinese consumers in the East seek higher quality food inputs from reliable countries like Canada. So got to have got to have a careful eye on risk, but a degree of confidence that over time we have what they need. And I don't mean that in a sort of a nasty bullying way, but just in a very realistic sense. China's going to need us. And smart people in China know that already. They will bluster and try to bully us, but we have what they need. We need to absolutely diversify markets so that we're not as dependent, but we also should feel a degree of confidence given the nature of Canadian expertise. The other thing, of course, is we cannot take our eyes off the importance of infrastructure to deliver those products to China. And that's an area where I think I've been very frustrated with our inability to, particularly when it comes, for example, to energy resources, to upgrade our delivery infrastructure. Because a country like Canada, that's part of our national security, having one of the best infrastructure systems in the world. And I don't see a commitment to achieve that.
Well, on that point, I would very much agree with you, and I see the point you're making about interdependency and how, I think maybe the business concept that would most evenly translate as might be leverage. And it doesn't necessarily mean a form of nastiness. It just means a form of understanding, where you're needed and where you need someone else. And particularly on the energy front, speaking from an Alberta perspective, we
Absolutely.
see a tremendous opportunity to be setting, a lot more liquefied natural gas into the Asia Pacific market for the environmental benefits, maybe first and foremost, it offsetting higher polluting and higher emitting forms of energy, the economic benefits. But you've layered in the geopolitical, that the greater we can increase those levels of dependency, it can act as a bit of a stabilizing force.
More than half of global capacity when it comes to coal-generated power is in China. And China is still hooked on coal because it has large reserves of coal. It has committed to getting off that, but we're a long way away from that. And Canada has answers that China needs, just as we've seen Canada has answers that the Europeans need as well. But we don't seem inclined to want to answer those requests directly, and that's a real tragedy, because I think foreign policy includes national competitiveness and economic strength. And if you ignore those things or fool around with them the way we seem to be fooling around with them, not taking them seriously, you erode your national security.
As we close in on the last couple of minutes here, David, I wanted to do what I think is the most fun part of the podcast with you, which is lightning round, where I hit you with 2 or 3 of the most, sort of emergent topics on this issue that we've been talking about and kind of get your take. And maybe I'll start with the first one, your quick take on how meaningful is the phone conversation that happened earlier this week between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Zelensky.
I think it's meaningful, but only in the sense that I think it illustrates what China is trying to do, which is it's favoring Russia in this conflict. It can't have Russia defeated. Xi Jinping is an ally to China, but China is also positioning itself. Ukraine was a major trading partner of China, to be able to act as something of a moderator if a brokered peace appears. So China is just playing both sides of the street here in a cynical way, but that's the nature of what amounts to Chinese diplomacy these days.
This week, you mentioned earlier, China's also rolled out some new anti-espionage legislation. How significant is that going to be?
It should be very significant. We should still be thinking back to what happened to the 2 Michaels. That can happen. China can manufacture a backstory about you with alarming ease. And so right now they tend to be targeting firms like Bain, or there was another firm that helps to investigate corruption. And so foreign investors use. So they tend to be targeting firms that are kind of nosy and interested in what's happening behind the scenes in China. But they can the laws are so broad that they can pick up or sweep up just about anybody. And that's something that expats need to think about and need to worry about. Unfortunately for us, the first casualties are often people of Chinese origin. And we have Canadians of Chinese origin who've been picked up and victimized, and they're seen as the easiest victims. And sometimes we wouldn't even be informed by the Chinese government that they'd arrested them. So it's a big problem and it's getting bigger. And it's something that expats need to think about very, very carefully.
So as we draw to a close here, I'll ask you kind of one final question, which is the big one and the hard one. If you're advising Canada's decision makers on how we should be relating to China with everything we've just talked about and everything that you know, what would your sort of core piece of advice be for the year or couple years ahead?
We're no longer in the business of comprehensive engagement. Every idea, every possible linkage with China is a good one. We need managed engagement, smart engagement that address Canadian interests directly. We haven't had that for a long time because smart engagement is part of a real foreign policy where we think realistically about who we are as a country, what our needs are, and how we need to navigate in a changing world. Until we get there, I'm afraid that we're going to be muddling along with China and changing tune with whatever news story prevails that day. But we should sit back, take a deep look at where our interests are, where they aren't, and have the guts to do fewer things with China, but things that matter to Canada.
The guts to do fewer things, but things that matter. Thank you, David, for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta. You can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com, and we'd love to connect with you on social media. So give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more of these episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.